Okay, might as well go ahead and get started. I know I only have 20 minutes and I do have 24 slides to share. First thing I want to do though is acknowledge Mike Grunwald. Mike was a park horticulturist with Game and Parks Commission for many years. And Mike retired a few years ago, but he had put this presentation together for the Rainwater Basin Joint Venture Informational Seminar. And so I took his presentation and I did make some updates and additions and things to it. But the skeleton of this presentation was put together by Mike. One of your first questions you might ask is, why should we be concerned about cottonwoods around wetlands and their impacts? Well, we're not so much concerned about riverine systems or wetlands with a groundwater connection because they get a continuous feed of water, either from the stream itself or the river or from groundwater, such as in the sandhills. What we're really more concerned about are isolated wetlands, such as rainwater basin wetlands or central table playas, for example, that do not have a continuous source of water. As most of you on here know, playas receive their water from runoff. They're usually perched above the water table. Both of the two wetlands I mentioned, the rainwater basin wetlands and the central table playas, are in two of our BULs, the Rainwater Basin BUL and the Central Les Hills BUL. So these are important components of the habitats within that BUL. And so we want to make sure that we keep them in a good condition. But I would mention that isolated wetlands are scattered throughout Nebraska, and most were embedded in the prairie landscape. So we had natural processes that kept trees out of these isolated wetlands, prairie fires burning through them, and large herds of ungulates, such as bison, grazing through them, that kept the plant community in these isolated wetlands more in a herbaceous state. But now we exist in an altered landscape and trees are expanded westward, and cottonwoods have become a threat to isolated wetlands. First thing I want to do is run through a little background information about cottonwoods. You can see here our native cottonwoods. We have the eastern cottonwood, which is actually our Nebraska state tree, and also plains cottonwood. We do have other cottonwoods, according to Mike, that are found in the state. You can see them here, the Rydberg's cottonwood, narrow-leaved, and the balsam poplar. But they're only in far western Nebraska. As a matter of fact, those three are only in Scottsbluff and Sioux counties. Cottonwood facts. They are a member of the willow family. I didn't even realize that, I guess, until I started researching a little bit more. They usually live about 70 years. If anything older than 70, if you're getting up to 120-year-old cottonwood, that's a very long-lived cottonwood tree. Flowers do appear in the spring on separate trees before leaves start growing, because cottonwoods are dioecious, so there are male and female trees, and only the female trees produce that fluffy seed that we're all familiar with. Some more quick facts. Seed matures in mid-May, wind dispersed by mid-June. And interestingly enough, this usually corresponds to receding water levels in wetlands and rivers that exposes these mudflats and sandbars for them to seed onto. Heavy seed crops are produced nearly every year. Cottonwood is a pioneer species and is intolerant of competition. As I said, they tend to seed onto floodplain or mudflat or bare moist soil, and tend to develop even-age stands. As shown in this picture, you can see all the little cottonwood seedlings on this Platte River sandbar. These stands can become very dense and often difficult to manage. Some more facts, cottonwood is classified as a phreatophyte, and that's a plant with a root system that draws its water supply from near the water table. So that's an important fact. They can grow up to 3 to 6 feet per year. Our Native Americans made dugout canoes from the trunks and a medicinal tea from its bark. Here's another interesting fact. The light seeds are carried by the wind and can spread up to 6 miles away. So a pretty broad dispersal area from one tree. Native establishment, they occur naturally along lakes, streams, and rivers. And as I mentioned, the seed easily germinates on moist, bare ground. So this is something to keep in mind. Prevention, if you want to avoid getting a dense stand of cottonwood seedlings, you should minimize your disturbance to soils near wetlands, rivers, other wet areas from late winter through early summer when that seed dispersal period occurs. So are cottonwoods assets or liabilities? Well, I think you'll see that they're both. Here are just some of the assets that I have listed: aesthetics, fall color, kind of the same thing, lumber, wildlife habitat, shade. These are all good things, and there's probably some other assets you can think about or think of. But are they a liability? A water loss for wetlands? In a riparian woodland situation, research that I looked at says yes, they do can affect hydrology of streams. And I'll show you some of that information here a little bit later. Cottonwood thickets or large trees next to isolated wetlands, also probably yes. And that's what we're concerned about with cottonwoods next to isolated wetlands. So one example of cottonwood transpiration is this particular study that was done by Julie Coonrod with the University of New Mexico. She studied both evapotranspiration and transpiration in the Middle Rio Grande Bosque in New Mexico, which is cottonwoods and invasive species. She estimates an average human household uses about an acre-foot of water, or 325,850 gallons per year. So, your standard household. She also estimated that approximately 1 acre of that Middle Rio Grande Bosque uses an equivalent of 3 acre-feet of water per year. So fairly high water usage, water demand. Here's some other quick estimates of water. And I would point out these were all conducted on riparian woodlands next to streams and drainages. Cermak in 1991, working in Arizona, estimated that red oak had a daily water consumption of 122 gallons per day. Cottonwood had a maximum daily water consumption of 244 gallons per day. So that's quite a bit. And then Cleverly et al. In 2002, although riparian vegetation only covered about 8% of the Rio Grande watershed, riparian evapotranspiration accounted for roughly 29% of the water loss. And then I found this paper. It has a lot of good information in this, and I would encourage you to read this paper if you're interested, by these authors, and it can be found in the UNL Digital Commons. But just to summarize what information from that paper, the short answer is yes. Invasive riparian woody plants do affect hydrology and ecosystem services or processes. So this is our problematic situation around isolated wetlands. You can see all of these cottonwood trees that started growing along the edge of this isolated wetland that had been restored. You've got quite a thicket developing here. I will say that since this picture was taken, these cottonwood trees have been taken care of. Here is an example of a potential impact to an isolated wetland. This is a real life example. Our blue-winged WMA in Clay County, which is roughly this area that I'm highlighting with the cursor, there were an estimated 450 to 500 cottonwood trees growing on the hydric soil footprint on private land. And that's this large gray mass of trees you see here. So I did some quick, simple math and I just went with 450 large trees. I scoped it way down to 150 gallons per day each tree. And I used a 183-day growing season, and you can see the results here. 12 million, over 12 million gallons of water, which equates to 37.9 acre feet. If I went with the 244 gallons per day, that bumps up to 61 acre feet. And data from the Rainwater Basin Joint Venture tells us that Blue Wing has a maximum storage capacity of 160 acre feet. So these cottonwoods we're potentially removing 23.6% of the water if the wetland is at full storage capacity, and we use that lower figure of 150 gallons per day. And I will also mention this is another project that private lands project that is being worked on. These trees have been removed. So a quick summary, review of research suggests in general, cottonwoods contribute to water loss wetlands, but as far as isolated wetland hydrology, we're not exactly entirely clear just to what degree. So this kind of points out a need for research on isolated wetlands. Could be a good research project for someone. Shift gears a little bit here and run through some quick cottonwood management techniques that are being used. Well, this is the most commonly used management tool for large cottonwoods, and that's simply dozing and removing. As you can see in those piles, I think this is along the Platte River, actually, might be one of those wet meadow areas that we learned about earlier. Cottonwood management techniques continued. The two greatest threats to cottonwood are fire and drought. Cottonwoods are vulnerable to fire, and as noted here, even light burns will kill seedlings. Hotter fires can severely injure older trees, and then that frequently opens those trees up to decay. And if sufficient understory exists, vegetation exists, burning is the cheapest and most efficient method to eliminate cottonwoods. This is your ideal scenario for burning cottonwood trees if your goal is to remove them. Burn early in the year when vegetation is still dry and has not started to green up. Burn while the trees are still small. As you can see in this picture, there are some small saplings, maybe two-year-old trees. Make sure you do have adequate vegetation for fuel, like this field has lots of dried grass, and because what you want to do is you want to create a very hot fire to burn those cottonwood trees. Our next one we want to address are herbicide applications. You know, I'm not a, you know, nobody's a big proponent of use of herbicides, you know, in wildlife habitats or whatever, but sometimes it is a technique that, you know, we have to turn to for various reasons. You can do herbicide injections where if you got a low number of trees, you can apply it to cut surfaces or use the tree injection method as shown in the hatchet is shown in this lower left hand. Rodeo is probably the most commonly recognized herbicide that is used for aquatic weed and brush control. This next slide kind of gives you a guideline for cut stump application, you know, using a 50 to 100% solution. injection and frill applications of 25 to 100% solution. And I did talk to someone from the NRCS here a while back, and they had foliar sprayed rodeo on 15 to 20 foot tall cottonwood trees on WRP wetlands and had achieved good kills. So that's another option. Here quickly are 4 other chemical products that some of our land managers are using to control trees. And these are all labeled for use near water. Arsenal, Habitat, Polaris, and a new one I just learned about was this Vastland. And as you can see, and from their label, they are all approved for use around aquatic sites. Here's another one, shredding or mowing. If you've got continuous stands or thickets of small trees, but then you really do need to immediately boom spray herbicide over those cut stems, because as what I've got highlighted in red here, the failure to treat off the cut stems probably will make the problem worse the next year as above ground shoot development. The next year often results in 4+ new stems or suckers per plant. And I'll mention this again. Another cottonwood management technique is disking or rototilling seedlings and saplings up to 1/2 inch in diameter. And finally, grazing. Defoliation via cattle should be used with the understanding that it may work, but it might not. And I'll explain why. Usually you'd need a very high stocking rate of cattle, and that equates to more than 0.75 cows per acre, if your goal is to defoliate deciduous trees. Cattle will eat the leaves, but not the stems. They have had greater success using horses and goats. As you can see here, these goats are getting up on these trees, but these trees are already pretty much too big to be much affected by grazing. Here is some additional cautionary notes about grazing and why it might not work. And I'm just going to read through these very quickly. Second year and older cottonwoods have developed root systems. So the goal is to reduce nutrient reserves in the roots. That's what your goal should be.
About 2 minutes, Randy.
Okay, thanks, Colleen. Defoliation techniques such as grazing and shredding of 2+ year old trees with established root system sends the trees into an above ground shoot development defense. And again, that's where if cut or grazed off trees are not treated with herbicide, the result is trees developing as many as 4+ stems rather than just one sucker. And when the trees implement that strategy, they end up shading out fuel beneath the trees that would support fire mortality. So you should have a contingency plan in place for the following growing season or two, as you may need it if you're trying to control cottonwoods with just grazing. And it may actually necessitate the need for mechanical removal. So that's really all that I have. Hopefully you glean some good information out of this as far as a little bit more information about cottonwoods. It's one of my favorite trees in Nebraska, cottonwoods, along with bur oaks. So I'm not a cottonwood tree hater by any stretch. A lot of fond memories of cottonwoods growing up on the farm. And so, you know, they're just like what we call weeds. If they're growing in the wrong place, such as next to an isolated wetland, that's just a place we don't want them. They certainly have plenty of spaces in Nebraska where they are appropriate, but isolated wetlands really aren't one of those. So that's the end of my presentation.
All right, stop the recording here.